Hi, I'm Rina Banerjee.
And I'm Courtney J. Martin. You know what? Let me see if I can. Here we go. So Rina Banerjee and I have known each other now for closer to 20 years. I first knew her work because I had seen it just before she was in the Whitney Biennial, which she says was the year 2000. I thought was in the late 90s, but maybe I just saw the work before then and became really interested in what she was making. At the time, she was making these, what I thought of as being large-scale sculptures that had so many parts that they almost felt to me like they were very precarious in a sense, but they never, for as much as they seemed like they were unwieldy, they were always incredibly contained. There was a lot of beauty in the work. And there was also, from my perspective, a great deal of narrative. And by narrative, I mean not so much that one came to the work with an understanding of what it was or that there was a story about it, but that inside of the work, and if one immersed him or herself into the work, that there was something to be gained by the relationship of the multiple objects with each other. And I think that the viewer then was not just a viewer, but was in fact experiencing the works. I think that that's something that's carried on, and so I'm hoping that we will talk a bit about that relative to the works that are now at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art in Philadelphia. Rina's show just opened this week, which is incredible, and this is your largest exhibition to date, and it is also, it has a major touring schedule. I counted there 5 venues.
Yes,
right?
There's a total of 5 venues that stretches from the 25th of October, which was a couple of days ago, to, I think, 2022, ending with, I think, the Tennessee location.
I think your last venue is my hometown of Nashville, Tennessee, which I feel maybe is a personal thing, but it may not, it probably isn't. It's probably just me hoping that it would be this really logical way that the work would come directly to see me. So the first thing that I'd really like to talk about is, tell me what is in this show. The images that we'll look at today are from the exhibition, but walk us through. What are we looking at right here?
So this is a work that was collected by the museum, and it was a work that I originally made for Prospect 4. If some of you are familiar with Prospect, it's an exhibition that was in New Orleans, and it occurs every 2 years, like a biennial. And it originated with as a project that was curated by Dan Cameron, and since then there have been various curators who have kind of guided that project or exhibition in New Orleans. I made this work working with Trevor Schoonmaker, who is at the Nasher Art Museum in Duke University, and he invited me to do a piece that would be at the Contemporary Art Center in downtown New Orleans. So I made this piece. It's for short, that's the whole title, that long paragraph, really to think about the history of New Orleans in conjunction with its commerce and also my own personal history. So since my daughter was in school, she had been talking to me about Bengali history. I'm Bengali, which means I'm from Bangladesh originally. And during partition, it was a very difficult time of migration and division. And my daughter was interested in our personal history as a family. And so I became more curious about that migration coming to the United States. And as it so happens, a term used at the time, at the turn of the century, called Black Bengalis, were these Bengalis who came from Bangladesh on American steamships, and they arrived at Harlem, and from Harlem they migrated to various cities in the United States, including New Orleans as one of them. Viola then became a project for me as I was reading about this migration. And Viola was an African-American woman in New Orleans who married a Bengali man, and it was a common kind of tradition of the times during that migration and during the southern migration of slaves that these kinds of marriages became possible, and it allowed a certain kind of commerce to emerge out of it. So this work is comprises of two structures. The one that you see almost looking like a star, I call the parachute part, and the rescue worker who is in her mask, Viola herself. They had these kind of welcoming houses for immigrants that came from Bangladesh in the various cities, and they often had these welcoming houses in the churches, the black church. And a lot of the people who came with silkens, silkens because that was the trade that they had in Bangladesh that they were kind of transporting to the U.S. And so that trade became part of the family trade as they became integrated into other families.
I just want to give, this is such a rich tale that you're telling. I want to give a sense of the longer story that you've just woven for us. So on the one hand, you're talking about the turn between the 19th and the 20th century, when some of that migration would have taken place between, the former Bengal and the United States. Then you're moving forward a bit to the period between, I would say, mid-1920s up through just after the Second World War, when you have what would be called actually a simmigration in America, where you've got rural populations coming into urban centers like New Orleans because of the loss of family farms and the sort of traction across the states. Then you've got the end of the Second World War and the returning, I think, of America as a superpower in 45, and the loss of Europe as a major world power and the remaking of Europe after this point. Then you've got 1947, which is the partition, meaning the split of the whole of India into India and Pakistan and Bangladesh. Or it's a three-part split, even though we always think of it, I think, or historically, there is a way that it's written about. It's a two-part. It's actually three-part. And then you're also, I think, implied here is 2005's Katrina, which was the major hurricane and subsequent devastation in New Orleans that then gave us this really dramatic wave of migration that, by many people's toll, has been calculated as larger than either what is the previous migration called the Great Migration of the 20s through the 40s of people moving inside the states, as well as the transatlantic slave trade of people who were forced out of not just New Orleans, but in fact the entirety of the Delta region due to the devastation there. So this tale that you've woven is one that is, more than 100 years old in some ways, and its ramifications are still being felt each time some new sort of cataclysmic event happens. It produces another layer that then goes on to those other layers.
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing for me is to learn about why migration takes place, the crisis around it, and the impact of it in terms of producing new commerce, new types of identities that are kind of forged out of the reconnection to the new place or location. So I was very interested in taking a number of different motifs that I've really enjoyed learning about. One was Irish miners in Pennsylvania. I lived in Pennsylvania for a long time, and I knew of a curator, Jane Farver, who often spoke of Erie, Pennsylvania, and the mining towns there. And so I learned a lot about that, and I wanted to talk about that in this work. And so you'll see these bright white disc near the head, and so it references the miner going through these tunnels. And one of the things I like to do in my work is to parallel different visual kind of imagery that remind me of that migration. And when I was 3 years old in Bangladesh, when we had one of the raids by the Muslims into the Hindu villages. I remember going into these tunnels that were made under the goat farms with my mother to hide away from being slaughtered. And so I was thinking about that kind of crisis that takes place, that becomes an echo into, all kinds of new beginnings, you might say, but really this kind of chaos. I'm referencing really the use of multiple objects, where there is a sense of collection of smaller and larger things in an assembly.
Tell us a bit about this work. First of all, what would you call it as an object? Is this sculptural? Is it a relief? I mean, how do you describe the things that are wall-based but that are clearly moving into the third dimension?
Well, and one of the things, because I was really studied to be a painter, I was always very interested in the wall. And I think what the wall does that the floor doesn't do in the same way is your eyes move across the wall in the way that you see space through a window. And so there's a sense of movement, or almost like crawling, that you can experience when you have a wall-mounted sculpture, which is fairly shallow. So it creates a sense of movement that's weighted on the wall, going across the wall or going, up and down the wall, which is very different, I think, than when you have a fully three-dimensional piece that's realized in space. So I was very interested in exploring that, and also to bring in color in sculpture. So this particular piece, which has a turtle shell as one of the dominant things that you see in the center area, and a head, and a kind of crowning, and some shell lampshades that flower out from the ear area, and then 3 different separate wall mounts that kind of look like branching. So this was, I think, called, well, it's a long title, of course, and When Origins Fade, really about how we perceive and how far we go back in our own inheritance or lineage to identify who we are. What is a safe kind of window or space in which we can define ourselves, and what becomes illegitimate as going too far back. And
What does that mean? Like, how could you go too far back and it become illegitimate? Because if you just keep going farther back, wouldn't it be more and more true for you?
that's really the question. At some point, it's considered not a false in many ways. I think for my own experience, people, wherever I'm going in another country or in the US, it doesn't matter where, everyone assumes that I am Indian, and that's all I am. And what does being Indian mean as a racial identity? And most South Asians know that they're from multiple racial identities, which is never really embraced within South Asian culture. And so there's a falsehood around being South Asian, because being South Asian, you could be from anywhere. And that kind of construction of Indian nationhood and identity came about during that colonial period, where there was much more communication between the different parts of India. But as Indians were elsewhere, there was a diaspora that generated more kind of more ideas about what does it mean to be Indian. And certainly now, with everyone individually exploring their DNA. So one of the things that happened that year that I produced this work is my daughter wanted to find out what her DNA was. And she was very surprised because I was more mixed than her, and she thought that wouldn't happen. And it was very strange because among some of my friends and colleagues, they were very upset and rejected the idea that I would be part Native American, as well as being South Asian or Ethiopian and Egyptian and Etruscan and all these things. So the next question is always, well, how far back was that your DNA? And what kind of Native American, and if, Native American from Alaska, well, which tribe was it? So the idea of location and the precision that you can attain becomes very important in the minds of people's identity.
I am amazed that people have these questions about DNA. It's not a question that I have at all, because it is, it's a longer conversation about the way in which science, I think, we allow to become a truth, whereas we would never allow, say, literature to be a truth, or we would never allow language to be a truth. We're very interested in everything else being mutable, but for some reason we really believe in science, even if we disprove ourselves. If you read the AMA journal, you can disprove yourself every 6 weeks, or technically quarterly. But it's a fascinating thing that we hold it as a truth, even if we're willing to constantly understand that we can dispel the truths that we make out of it.
Yeah, I mean, science is a very interesting kind of place to find information. In this particular case, I mean, the fact that it is science possibly that's being used and it is not accepted at the same time is a crisis, and a crisis in identity and the way we identify different people in the world. If it's more complicated than what we see, then this question of, can you trust what you see? Are you seeing what you want to see, or are you seeing what the person, as a vessel, wants you to see? So there's a question of trust, both in the science and in the person that you have this relationship with.
So one of the things that I've always been really curious about, and I'm sure I've asked you this a million times, it's just that I keep wanting to know more answers, is your titles are beautiful. They're illustrative. They are critically engaging. They have, deep content. They are narrative focused. They give you both an understanding of the work as well as, often lead you off into thinking about other sources, right? And not just those coming out of literature. And yet, I am always questioning, why is it that you don't write independently of the object? Because I'm looking at a title like this, which this, by the way, the text that you see here is the full title of the work that it accompanies. Do you write independently ever, secretly?
Secretly, a lot of things happen, Courtney. I think one of the things is that you always question why you're attracted to certain objects, and then certainly the kinds of things that draw you to read, to question that you're curious about. And that comes into the title more easily than really actually talking about the objects. And I think that because there's a sense that what the artist shares about their own work is a place for a confession, I kind of shy away from saying, well, this object means this. So very much I want the possibility of the experience where the objects mean several things simultaneously at the same time that it's very slippery, what meaning is. And then there's different times in your own experience of yourself that you are in conflict. One day you feel like using a mask means this, and that's why you're using it. And another day you feel like, no, it doesn't. So this kind of argument with yourself is very important to place in the work as a means of really exploring who you are and what the world means in relation.
Are you saying that I guess I'm wondering, can I separate the titles and read them by themselves as just text? Like, is there an object in the sense of a performance or a text piece or poetry or any of the ways that we want to describe writing as form by itself inside of art? Could I separate them from the objects that you attach them to and think of them as something on their own?
I think it would be an interesting experience. I definitely think that you can collect the titles as a body of work. That is also visual in many ways, because the text can be strongly visual in poetry as well as any other writing, and that's its power. And I think the other thing I think is very attractive for me with the text is that it lends itself to a kind of credibility or transparency that the visual image does not, where people look at especially the accumulation of objects in a photo like this and will say, well, what am I looking at? Where in the text it's very clear, these are the words in what Rina wrote, and I know what they mean because I can look it up in a dictionary, and we can get a certain level of agreement that we're contracted to in some sense when we use language. And I think to reject poetry means that you hope for a certain level of freedom to structure what you write and to make it cooperate with the image of your work in a way that poetry isn't really real poetry. Doesn't have to be with an image, where the image in a poetry book would be more decorative. So in this case, there's a competition between the title and the artwork. Should you read it as different? And if you read it as the same, then there's the conflict of, well, why is it that one thing represents the other? So I do think about that, that kind of interaction between what is dominant and what is not dominant in your mind when thinking about meaning.
I'm just sorry, I'm now led myself on a little journey of thinking about whether or not what actually constitutes itself as real poetry and what doesn't. That's a later thought that I'll explore. I want to, the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts is this place that is very historically bound. It is one of the nation's oldest art schools, and it is this place that really was supposed to, at its inception, function in many ways like the French Academy functioned and still functions. It was also supposed to function as not so much a training ground, not only as, I should say, a training ground for artists, but also a place in which artists would become instituted professionally. So were I to have graduated from the academy in the 19th century, I would have then returned there for my yearly salon exhibitions. I would have hoped one day to have had a major exhibition there. I would have thought of myself as being a kind of senior leader, one of the great artists of our country. And yet that, America doesn't have that in the same kind of way. PAFA didn't become that place after a certain point. It starts out in that way, but it doesn't happen. And yet, that's exactly what the building looks like. Was it difficult to work in a building that had that kind of situated academic history?
Well, it was a lot of fun to work in that kind of structure. Its presentation is like you describe an academic environment, one that is almost spiritual in the way that the building presents itself as kind of almost church-like, bank-like situation with its foyer and its grand staircase and all multiple arches and the gold kind of moldings and the skylights that present daylight in every room. All those things present, as well as these paintings of everyone from famous people to families to, maybe an assortment of still lifes and shipwrecks. And so it really kind of is a place that it sends you to another time in its impact. And at the same time, I think because my work is interested in history, I was very happy to kind of have a curation of paintings around the work and sculpture as well, which the sculptures are mostly soft as opposed to the sculptures that were in the building, which the building presents itself with marble and stone and bronze as classical sculpture, and plaster, of course. So it really kind of broadens the way you think of the object. And you begin to see for myself those things that are made of these other things that are more valued at a certain point and may still be as solid sculpture that will last forever. You have these more ethereal, kind of less permanent materials.
And yet you're using materials, often you're using feathers, shells, coins, beads, the kind of beads that were used for trading. I mean, you're using the things that people actually, that have endured over time, or they're replicas of things that have endured over time, because people actually use them and need them for daily commerce. Most of us don't. We might have marble in the kitchen, but most of us are not actually trading in chunks of marble daily. I mean, there's an interesting way in which the things that you're engaged with are much more enduring, I think, for most of our lived experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I think what is important in the work is really thinking about how we approach the durability and portability of items. Things that are made of iron and steel have a certain permanence that we believe in, and things that are made of protein, like feathers or silk, or in this case, Little Red Riding Hood here has mohair on the braided steel. But there is still steel in a lot of my sculptures. It's just not the focus of the sculpture. And so the structure may be steel or wood, and then there's all this textile that is created on top of it as a blanket or clothing for the sculpture. So there's a reference to dressing the sculpture, which I'm interested in as well.
You're interested in textiles. You've worked across many mediums. You've painted, you've done draft making, you made film. But you were also an engineer. Does that training, how do you come together as a maker with all of those different mediums and skill sets? How does that happen?
Well, it's a lot of fun to work with different materials because you have to figure out how they can have a conversation as opposed to where one material is dominant over another. And it helps to have a material science background to know what is really archival and what is not. Because I think what I've found is most conservators don't have the level of education to know really that most of our expertise and knowledge about what lasts is about things like linen and feather and shell. That is mostly what is ancient art in the museum. And we have less knowledge about some other things like alloys, metal alloys, as opposed to, iron or aluminum. And I think those things really come to play when I really want to explore the things that we do live with every day, that are close to our bodies, that are in our homes. And I think that kind of pleasure and touch comes with even more depth and sensitivity when you have things that you want to wear. And I'm inviting that kind of conversation to take place, I think it's also that some of the softer materials invite a sense of smell in a way that when you are thinking about touching metal or stone, you are not thinking about what it smells like. So there's a kind of awareness of how these softer materials can absorb our oils and our scent, and a kind of rejection of them from that kind of disgust.
Maybe that's a good place to stop and open the floor for questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I wasn't really sure what I wanted to convey for you that I'm interested in when I was talking, and so you're probably wondering, were you talking about? Yeah. Yeah. I guess we always come to the point where we feel we're more than our culture as individuals. We have a certain sense that, you know, you can't be kind of contained within all these other ways of identifying who you are. And the information that allows you to understand a person is so vast, you know, and it should be vast, you know, for you to really find out what is it that you like, what is it that you're attracted to, and why, and where does it stem from. So, you know, I think when you do that, you begin to loosen up your ties to a specific space and a specific culture, and any specificity at all becomes a kind of garment that needs to be taken off in order to see the real body, the naked you know? And so I think artists, everyone, you know, is curious about that, you know? And I think they're very primal kind of questions we have about why we do that and why we're preoccupied with that, you know? And especially as you get older, I think, now I think about why is it so important for us to experience art and to share it, you know, which makes it different than making art for just yourself or your family.
I think that's a very interesting subject, the conservation of smell. I know that because I remember working with you when you had bottles, and I think we actually closed the bottles. But it's wonderful to hear that feathers and materials absorb smell and oils, etc. What is your knowledge on that particular subject?
So I'm just interested in how we react to the scent of things. I've always been very sensitive about smell, and I feel like you can really smell who people are, or when you're, especially if you live in an urban place and you're in the subway, you can't wait to get out because you're smelling too much. And then there's the pleasure of smell, like it comforts you when you come to your home, or, you know, my daughter certainly smells her mother and smells her father. So it really does send a message to you, a reaction, and that reaction is a chemical one. And it's a very real one that we have to things where we can be shaped by it. because it's a communication with our body chemistry. And so you can like smells and dislike them. And I think that things that can retain smell has a certain category of benefit as well as danger to them, in a way that things that do not absorb smell are more safer, and more people are willing to interact with those things. And so really things that have smell communicate with us in a way that we may like or not like, but we have a definite interaction with. And I feel like that has something to do with why we prefer to be drawn to art that is without odor, without smell, which can be conserved, which is in our minds more permanent. But really, I mean, most plastics absorbs oil, but you still smell the plastic first because it's so much stronger. It's telling you a little bit about its own identity. So smelling is something you do in a chemistry lab all the time, just for your own safety, but also as part of the experiment when you're dealing with different materials and finding out what their identity is, which is what I used to do as a polymer engineer. We'd have all these graphs and methods of sending light out to a material and finding out what they were when we didn't know what they were. And that's why my interest in DNA is very much about how it impacts the way we think of ourselves and the way people think of each other, rather than I'm really curious to know who my ancestors were, which I think is impossible to really have a feeling for,